So a model walks into a JavaScript framework. Controller says, "What are you having?" The model says, "You tell me." So I'm Anthony Navarre. I work at Factory Design Labs, and I have a bone to pick with JavaScript MVC frameworks. No, that's not quite right. I don't have a bone to pick with JavaScript MVC frameworks. I have a bone to pick with MVC. Actually, that's not right either. I have a bone to pick with MVC prisons. And what I mean by that is that as an industry, and through no fault of the framework itself, we seem to have kind of pigeonholed ourselves into this thinking that everything is that going to be a model, or is this going to be a view, or and we need to stop that. I think that as on the whole, a lot of us in this room kind of get that we need to use other patterns, but there's this problem that we're really comfortable in the back end. I know that's at least my problem when I'm writing JavaScript. I'm really comfy in the back end, not so comfy on the front end. And I think that part of that is because JavaScript is weird to us because it's asynchronous. We don't get a lot of that in Ruby. That's happening more in Ruby nowadays, but it doesn't happen on an everyday basis. And it's also evented, also not something we don't see a lot in Ruby. And it's got these crazy things that we have to deal with that are always unpredictable users. And so I won't talk about this one, but it also just so happens that this is a little bit unfamiliar to us too, and in that functions are first-class citizens that we can pass around in JavaScript much more easily. And I have a confession to make about that, and all of those things combined with my discomfort mean that I'm often very guilty of writing bad JavaScript. I end up in places where I have callbacks inside of callbacks inside of callbacks. And, which by the way, does anyone know what happens when you have an error inside of that situation? That's called an exception. So I'm totally guilty of it, but I think the overall reason that we fall into this trap is that we don't know where to reach for certain patterns, because the patterns that apply to front-end stuff aren't necessarily the patterns that make sense on the back-end stuff, right? So I think that we should be looking at Cocoa a little bit, because Cocoa is a battle-tested framework for Objective-C development on the iPhone, for instance. And it's an MVC framework too. Now, I don't know much about it, so I'm gonna end up saying some stuff that isn't correct, but it's an MVC framework too, and it has built in a lot of patterns that are complementary to MVC. And I think we should be looking at those. I'm not gonna go through all of them. There's a bunch of patterns on the front end, but here are a few that come to mind for me that are pretty much directly applicable to JavaScript development, in my opinion. And I think I can't draw straight lines to these other bits, but there's some kind of parity between the problems on the right, or the features on the right, excuse me, and the patterns on the left. And I'll talk very briefly about one of them, delegation. I mean, it's just you get an object to act as the delegate for another object. The first talk of this morning was a perfect example of how you push that responsibility off to some other object. And we ought to be able to use more patterns from Objective-C. I'm not going to give any concrete examples, perhaps a longer talk some other time, but I think we should all be looking in this direction. I certainly will be, to try to improve my JavaScript code. Thank you very much.